Hey, welcome back, everyone. A lot I want to talk about, as you can see, first of all, I'm still on the road, but be back in next week. Folks, great having you all here. A lot I want to talk about today. First, I want to go into the World Economic Forum talking about the next pandemic. And this is important because those of you who remember will remember that with COVID-19 and with monkeypox, they had germ games right before the viruses hit. And let's put it this way, hypothetically speaking, if a group of gang members got together like every Wednesday of every month and got together with like red spray paint, and then the following day the whole town was robbed and there was red spray paint everywhere, even though you might not be able to say the gang did it, you might start suspecting something. When it comes to the World Economic Forum and like a lot of these groups that hold these games, they keep holding these preparations for these pandemics, and then suddenly a pandemic hits, and suddenly it seems to be basically exactly what they prepared for and what they said was going to happen. It's again, not saying they're going to do anything with this, but it's important to pay attention when they do talk about this, because either there's some weird planning involved, or they're just like living oracles and they predict the future. The next pandemic they're talking about is interesting because the way they're talking about it is more on the policy level, I should note, and less so of the germ game type and more so of what they're planning to do in terms of what they prioritize. And this is no longer just about health. This is about race. This is about seemingly eugenics to some extent. I'll get into it. I'll explain it. I'll show you some videos. Interesting episode lined up today. Also, folks, the new narrative is in. If you do not get a vaccine, I'm afraid that you may, in fact, be a terrorist. There's also now what they call anti-science extremists. And so you may be a terrorist or anti-science extremist if you do not get a vaccine. And you actually also are apparently at higher risk of getting car accidents because you're more likely to break the law. And they have, I'm not even joking, scientific reports out on this. And the important part with this as well is this is the way the narrative is being framed. This is the way they're creating new labels to define people who decide they don't want to believe everything that comes out in the evening news or something like that. Important stuff. And folks, also we're going to have Brian Gibson on today, pastor, talk about the Respect for Marriage Act and what that actually means for religious liberty. All right, that said, interesting episode lined up today. Thank you all so much for being here. Folks, those of you on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter now, and Facebook, please join us on Epic TV after about 25 minutes. Again, I do an hour-and-a-half show. Only the first 25 minutes or so is on these channels. So that said, let's jump into it. First story here. Let's start straight from the horse's mouth, folks. World Economic Forum. And this is what they say. This is, again, recently from Davos 2022 to Davos 2023. The 6 themes that have set the agenda now. Now, of course, I'm not going to go over their whole agenda, but there's one part in particular I want to talk about, which is theme number 4. And theme number 4 states, preparing for the next pandemic requires ending health disparities. What does that mean? So they're looking now at basically framing pandemics is basically not just viruses, not just monkeypox or SARS-CoV-2, but instead actual like systemic racism and things like this. They're framing it as more of an illness on the body politic, the Volk, as the Germans might have said. Let me explain what they're doing with this. Further in, it states, COVID-19 has been a hot topic during every annual meeting since January 2020 when the virus emerged. And thanks to the vaccines, attendees were able to return to Davos, again, World Economic Forum, more than 2 years later. However, the pandemic looks quite different in many low-income countries, where just 13% of people are vaccinated, compared to 75% of people in high-income countries. Now, they're talking mainly about Africa, and this is a bit of a strange narrative because those of you watching the virus, numbers and stuff like that, you may notice something very interesting, which is Africa has hardly had like COVID deaths. Africa has fared better than most of the world, other than the parts, ironically, where you've gotten higher rates of vaccination. But for the most part, Africa has actually fared really well with COVID-19. Some people have attributed this to the fact that people in these countries regularly take things like hydroxychloroquine, because you do have higher rates of malaria in these countries. Hydroxychloroquine, of course, being an antiviral drug, people take it as a preventative against malaria, and has now been shown to be at least effective to a degree against COVID-19. It's not quite clear why you've had lower deaths in Africa. Some people attribute it to that. Some people attribute it to the fact that they have much lower vaccination rates. But the World Economic Forum now is saying something interesting, which is they're suggesting Africa basically needs to be ground zero for all the new preparations for the next global health crisis. Let me show you. They say this. This is a quote from Winnie Byanyima, the Undersecretary General of the UN and Executive Director of the Joint UN Program on HIV/AIDS during a session on racial equity on the anniversary of George Floyd's death. She said, racism is not only when black people or brown people cannot breathe because of police violence. She's like in the United Nations, she's talking about Africa, right? This isn't an America thing. She says this, racism is when black people, brown people, people of color take their last breath because of policy violence. Now, I've never heard of policy violence before, but they're saying the new problem is policy violence. And she says, when they are denied life-saving, pandemic-ending medicines. So if you're in Africa and you're unable to get the COVID-19 vaccine, they call that now racial violence, policy violence. And those who do not help get vaccinations to Africa are now guilty of policy violence. And she continues stating, when they can't access care or education because debt is choking them. Well, I have a big problem with debt also. I'm not personally in debt, but I tend to not like the taxation systems in the West very much, and I think that the debt systems are terrible, so I'd agree to some extent with that. But I think, of course, the people proposing this, ironically, some of the biggest advocates of high taxation and debt, so I take it with a grain of salt coming from them. Further in what states, it says corporations are taking immediate steps to, and I'm going to go into why this matters in a sec, so hear me out, right? Corporations are taking immediate steps to end disparities. So why are businesses getting involved with this? Corporations are taking steps? It says during Davos, Pfizer, of course, which makes one of the vaccines, a strategic partner of the World Economic Forum, you getting that? Launched a, quote, an accord for a healthier world, offering all of its patent-protected medicines and vaccines, including the COVID-19 vaccine, on a not-for-profit basis to 45 lower-income countries. And it states, leaders at Davos 2022 discussed how governments, corporations, and other stakeholders can collaborate to improve health equity, not equality, but equity, socialism, in other words, equality of outcome, right? Where you force people into equality. If they're too rich, you make them poor. If they're poor, you make them a bit richer by stealing from the rich. Although I doubt the frankly wealthy millionaires and billionaires of this particular group are the ones who think they're going to get robbed through this, right? It's going to be other folks like the middle class. It says, starting with preparing for the next pandemic. And it says, quote, investing in health systems and regional bodies like Africa CDC and African Medicines Agency must be a key priority, said Paul Kagame, president of Rwanda. And he said, quote, we have to act in the full expectation that there will be another pandemic. Now, why does that matter? Aside from just being concerning in terms of the way they're framing what a global health crisis is and redefining what racism is, on that note, they're basically redefining a global health crisis not as like a virus spreading not as like, COVID-19 or monkeypox. They're framing a global health crisis now as a racial crisis, as a crisis of inequality, of countries lacking socialism. In other words, they're basically framing the entire idea that if you don't have socialism, it may in fact be, a global health crisis. And they're also linking it to race. By linking it to race, they're basically using a actually, ironically, a very similar narrative to what the Nazis did. The sickness on the body politic. If you want to learn more about that, watch the interview I did with Dr. Aaron Cariardi, where we talk in depth about this. That was recent interviews I did, which you can find on Epic TV. Claiming there's a sickness on the body politic, which requires an emergency order of some kind to essentially do things that they could not do under the normal constitution. In the case of the Nazis, that meant eliminating different unwanted groups from the body politic, Jews being among them, but others actually were included. They're doing the same thing in terms of claiming there's essentially a sickness on the body politic, racism being the problem they're pointing to, and inequality within that being the main cause of it. They're claiming, or not inequality, but lack of equity. Now, why does this really matter? Because this is in context of what just happened with the Biden administration giving a ton of money to Africa. And had you not known this background, I think it'd be harder to understand why they might be doing something like this, especially at a time when the United States is facing really serious financial problems. Let me show you. Business Insider Africa. It says Biden administration has pledged $55 billion with a B to Africa over the next 3 years. Now, this is like Ukraine Zelensky type donations. This is America giving away money when Americans are also not doing so well financially. This is the United States giving away money when the interest rates in America cost more than the annual defense budget, and they're spending more money beyond their means. This is like a person in debt who, basically can't make the month's rent, ordering 5 new credit cards and then maxing them all out. You don't spend money like that when you don't have the money to spend. They're doing that. The question then is, why are they doing it? Well, I put this in context of what we just discussed. It's part of the agenda. It's part of the global agenda. Let me show you what it says. It says, at the outgoing U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, this was just recently, actually, in Washington, President Joe Biden has declared that his country is all in on Africa's future. The U.S. president made the comments on Wednesday while addressing a conference of 49 African leaders, stating, "When Africa succeeds, the United States succeeds. Quite frankly, the whole world succeeds as well." In addition to his comments, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the United States aims to help African countries achieve their own goals. And it says, according to Sullivan, the White House is pledging $55 billion in economic, health, and security support for Africa over the next 3 years. Sullivan declined to give details. We don't know what they're using the money for, actually, saying the White House would reveal them during the coming 3 days of bilateral, multilateral talks and a dinner hosted by Biden at the White House for his African counterparts. Further in, it states, meanwhile, it's not just, this is important. Keep this in context of what we just discussed of Davos, World Economic Forum, noting that they need to basically get involved in Africa to end racial disparities, to bring vaccinations to Africa, and basically, get Africans vaccinated at least the same rates as the rest of the world. They said it's going to be a program involving not only, nations and so on, but also corporations. And what does this Biden meeting say? They say, quote, meanwhile, credit card company Visa said it would invest $1 billion in Africa to develop digital payments, i.e. digital currencies. And Cisco, with its partner, Sebastian, announced 10 cybersecurity contracts worth a total of $858 million. Microsoft, i.e. Bill Gates, formerly at least, also said it would roll out satellites to provide internet access to millions of people, starting in Egypt, Senegal, and Angola. DW reported, and it states, Sullivan also noted that the United States would tell the visiting leaders that it supports adding an African country to the permanent members of the UN Security Council Council and inviting the African Union to join the elite G20 countries. And if you remember as well, they recently wrapped up the G20 meeting in Bali in Indonesia. And during that meeting, the White House, the Biden administration, released basically the outline of it, which I noted repeatedly restated that the policies were in line with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Interestingly, I don't think they actually said Sustainable Development Goals. They just repeatedly said SDGs. And those of you in the know understand that the SDGs are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, specifically of the United Nations Agenda 2030. Meaning the G20 meeting was basically a big United Nations meeting pushing the Agenda 2030, which, as we noted as well, the World Economic Forum is a partner on. And when you understand it from that perspective, that while this is all part of the same basic agenda, Africa is the next big target because they did not really join the whole global elite in terms of getting their people vaccinated and rolling out these programs, and also that Africa is kind of the ripe ground for doing things that you could not legally do in other countries. One of the reasons, for example, why they're making Africa ground zero for a lot of the digital currencies, for example, forcing people to adopt them against their will, where people don't want to use it, so they begin limiting the amount of money people can even withdraw from banks. This group is abusing the African people. What they're doing is terrible for Africa. They are harming Africa. They're doing things against the will of the African citizenry. And frankly, again, as I said before, this is the new colonialism. The folks who lecture us about the history of colonialism, the folks who lecture us about how the evil, European nations went and colonized the world, this is Davos and the global elite, mainly from Europe, going and colonizing the world yet again, using, ironically, almost the same narrative. Remember, in the colonialist era, they talked about white man's guilt, the burden, the white man's burden. The idea that the European nations have the weight on their shoulders to bring civilization to the third world. That was the narrative used during the age of colonialism. They're doing the same thing, using almost the same narrative, that they have to end systemic racism, that it's the burden of the European nations somehow to bring these great gifts to the African people, where the African people have demonstrated basically that they don't want these things. In fact, again, they have to force them to adopt it against their will. Here we are, folks. All right, before we go further, today's episode, we do have a sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by Secure. And folks, over 155 million Americans were affected by data leaks in 2020. The average American had their personal data stolen about 4 times over the year. Now, folks, people get anxious because they can't protect their online data or activity, but now there's a new email and messaging app called Secure. That's SEKUR. That can give privacy and security for sending emails and messages. Secure's server and data center are hosted in Switzerland, which is important because Switzerland has the strictest data privacy laws in the world. Secure does not ask for your phone number, mine your data, or upload your contacts. Folks, it functions by adding people you know, then adding the secure numbers. You can also invite people just by sending them an invite. Those of you interested, it's $5 for the messenger, $7 for the email, or $10 for the email and messenger package. You can visit secure.com today for a free 7-day trial, or you can use the promo code Joshua to get 25% off. And folks, big thanks out to Secure for sponsoring today's episode. All right, I'm going to go further into this. Now, again, this is using the idea of a public health crisis to go after things unrelated, that we would normally think at least unrelated to, let's say, a pandemic. For example, ending disparities in other countries of the world, or creating equity programs. In other words, they're essentially using the idea of a public health crisis now as a Trojan horse. And within the Trojan horse is a whole hodgepodge of socialist policies. What, for example, does digital currency have to do with ending racial disparities? What, for example, does universal vaccination have to do with ending racial disparities in Africa? They're also talking about now racial disparities not as a local thing, not as an American thing, not as a European thing, but as a global thing. This is global equity. where the wealthy nations of the world need to support, like almost like a welfare system, the poorer nations of the world. And they also take it upon themselves to export I'd say, omnibus of new, kind of Agenda 2030 programs as part of that. These individuals being the ones pushing that, of course. Now, the other big thing important with this is that the very idea of healthcare is changing. Now, when we talk about healthcare, when I think about healthcare, I think like, going to the doctor or grandma, having her cancer treated or something like that. I think healthcare is in treating actual diseases. I think of healthcare as a kid breaks, his or her arm and goes to the hospital and gets their arm fixed. That's what I think of as healthcare. Healthcare no longer means that, at least not in terms of how it's being applied. Healthcare now is about, racial disparity. Healthcare is about reducing the human population. And I will show you a real example of that where Bill Gates is talking about that. Healthcare is one of you mentioned, like a death policy, pushing, for example, the suicide cult that Canada is advancing. That is what healthcare is now. And I want to show you a quick video. You might remember this guy, one of the key individuals at the World Economic Forum, Yuval Noah Harari, talking about how humans are hackable animals. Why does this matter? I want to show you this clip again because I want you to pay attention to something. Pay attention to what he says, that basically a public health crisis, a crisis, is an opportunity to force people to adopt things they would not normally adopt, to make them do things they would not normally agree to do. Understand this in context of what's happening right now. People don't want this. People would not normally go along with this. But they are adopting it because there's a crisis, and the crisis has become an opportunity to force them to do things they do not want to do. Let me show you him stating it.
Humans are now hackable animals. The whole idea that humans have, they have this soul or spirit and they have free will and nobody knows what's happening inside me. So whatever I choose, whether in the election or whether in the supermarket, this is my free will. That's over. Free will, that's over.
That's over.
Over. Today, we have the technology to hack human beings on a massive scale. Yeah, everything is being digitalized. Everything is being monitored. In this time of crisis, you have to follow science. It's often said that you should never allow a good crisis to go to waste, because a crisis is an opportunity to also do good reforms that in normal times people will never agree to. But in a crisis, you see, we have no chance. So let's do it.
Vaccine won't help us go
the
to
vaccine
the test, of course.
Will help us, of course. It will make things, more manageable.
Get that, folks? A crisis is an opportunity to make people do things they would not normally agree to do. And of course, COVID-19 being the big one they're pushing. And again, this guide maybe does not fully represent in its statements the agenda these people are pushing, but it's a commonly restated thing. Klaus Schwab, head of the World Economic Forum, wrote an entire book, you can buy it on Amazon, about how COVID-19 is basically a vehicle to implement the Great Reset, to implement essentially their entire omnibus of programs. They talk specifically about how COVID-19 being a crisis is also an opportunity to make people agree to do things they would not normally agree to do. That's how they are using this. That's how the narratives are working. And that's important to remember because the narratives are usually not the real issue. The narratives are just the vehicle to carry the real issue. The question always then is, what is the real issue if the narrative is not? I will often, I think, try to read between the lines with you all and show you what I believe the real narrative is. And frankly, it seems that, in my opinion, it's really a social control narrative, in my opinion, and one also of eugenics. And I want to show you Bill Gates explaining that. For that, though, let's jump over to Epic TV. Then I want to show you some other things of equal concern. And, of course, we'll also get on Pastor Brian Gibson to talk about the Respect for Marriage Act, what that means for religion. Folks, let me show you real quick I mentioned Dr. Aaron Cariardi. I did this interview with him about how the Nazis actually used very similar narratives to what's being played out right now. The Nazis actually declared a public health crisis. It was the use of that let them basically do things that they could normally not do. Much like in the United States right now, how under the public health crisis of COVID-19, the US government can violate certain constitutional rights to an extent, using that public health crisis as the vehicle. The Nazis did the same thing. Now, Dr. Aaron Cariardi and I had a great conversation about this, but we also go deeper into the actual agenda on where the current policies are leading us. I believe this is a very important interview. I'll show you the trailer for it. The full interview is on Epic TV. Let me show you that now.
There are strong forces pushing us in the direction of a biosecurity paradigm of governance that entails inventing and reinventing new crises to maintain and fuel this biosecurity regime on an ongoing basis. What's been in development for 20 years and was rolled out opportunistically during the pandemic is not just a novel method for trying to control an infectious disease, but really a novel paradigm of governance, a paradigm of governance that rests upon the legal mechanism of the declared state of emergency. So public health proved to be a very useful means of getting the population to do what health officials and other people in power wanted them to do.
Y'all paying attention? The creation of the biosecurity state, the use of a public health crisis, and in fact, rolling public health crisis, one ends, the next begins, as a way to implement these essentially totalitarian social control policies under the guise of a public health crisis, under the guise of being about medicine and so on. Take that in context of where they're going with these narratives. I mentioned, of course, COVID-19, monkeypox. Now they're talking about racial equity as being the new public health crisis. And I don't know what racial equity has to do with the public health crisis. Again, it's the vehicle they're using to implement these new policies, the advancement of the biosecurity state. All right, folks, again, you can watch that full interview on Epic TV. But that said, I have a lot more to go into today. We're going to jump over to Epic TV exclusively for the rest of this. I want to show you the video where Bill Gates is talking about basically how they plan to use some of this. And I want to go as well into the way the new narratives are being framed around extremism, terrorism. If you don't get a vaccine, they're trying to label you as a terrorist now. They're trying to label you as someone who will get in car accidents because you don't follow the law. We'll show that in a sec, folks. That says jump over to Epic TV for that, and I will see you there. Folks, thank you for being here.